Greetings to everybody in our virtual audience. This is a UWM Access event with Boswell Book Company. It is day 4,199 of Boswell being in business. Today's event, today's morning event, thank you for all waking up and getting to school or wherever you are, with Nic Stone, the amazing writer of Dear Martin and a few other books like Clean Getaway, Jackpot, Odd One Out, and Shuri, which is a Black Panther novel. Dear Justice is a companion book to Dear Martin, and it's just come out yesterday. And we are so excited that Stone will be in conversation with the wonderful educator and advocate, Shana Lucas, who has championed literature. Well, let me just say I've seen her in the bookstore and she loves books. And we are just so excited. UWM Access has put together a wonderful season of events and through the School of Education and working with the MPS schools, and Glen Hills Middle School has just been amazing. I pass it to Shana and Nic Stone. Thank you all.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! Thank you for that introduction, Daniel. I appreciate that. I appreciate you too. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Nic Stone, for being here. I really appreciate it. Good morning. How are you doing today?
You know, it is the day after a release, so I have no idea how I'm doing. It's like giving birth and then without the labor, without like the pain of labor. And then the next day, there's this thing there that wasn't there the day before. So yeah, I'm here.
Yes.
I'm excited to be talking to you all.
Yes. Thank you for spending time with us, me and my girl band here. We're so excited to talk to you. So we're going to start by talking about the first book you wrote a little bit, Dear Martin, and we'll get into the new book. So Sanai wants to ask the first question.
Okay.
Hey, Sanai.
Hi, my name is Sanai. My first question is, why did you write the book?
Dear Martin, I wrote, okay. Let's go back to when you were like 5 or something. 2012. How old were you in 2012?
Think.
Yeah, see, I was close. I had a baby that year. In June of 2012, I had a little boy. And then in November of 2012, there was an incident in Jacksonville, Florida, where a boy who was 17 was killed at a gas station over the volume of music coming out of the car he was sitting in. This probably sounds familiar if you've read Dear Martin, because that scene in Dear Martin is based on a true story. It's what happened to a young man named Jordan Davis. And after having just had a little Black boy of my own, hearing about this story where a boy lost his life because somebody didn't like the volume of his music, it kind of stuck me. And I wanted to explore. That's when I got the seed of the idea to explore, like, why, right? Why would a person decide that just because another person's music is loud, that there's some kind of a threat? Fast forward a little bit to 2014, another young man was murdered, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And the response to his death, first of all, he was killed by a police officer. That was a thing that I was like, whoa, because I grew up with a police officer in my house. My father was a police officer for 25 years. So that part shook me. And then there was a series, you guys were around in this spring, and we saw the response, the worldwide response to the death of George Floyd, and how there were protests and marches and people coming together to stand against racism. There was something similar that happened on a smaller scale in 2014 after the death of Mike Brown. But I kept seeing people like these political figures coming on television and stepping into public forums and saying things like, Dr. King would never support a movement like this. Dr. King would be appalled at some of the things you people are doing, right? I live in Atlanta, which is Dr. King's hometown. And there was a march happening here, an anti-racism march happening here in Atlanta. And the mayor got on TV and the mayor said, all I ask is that you don't take the freeways. Dr. King would never take a freeway. And I was like, I don't know which Dr. King he's referring to, but it could not be the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who did take a lot of freeways in his time, right? So hearing kind of this misinformation and people misquoting Dr. King or using his quotes in a way that I don't think that he would be okay with them being used made me want to explore why that was triggered with the Jordan Davis case through the lens of Dr. King's teachings. So that kind of combination of events is what brought Dear Martin together. So I have this 17-year-old boy who gets profiled and who starts writing letters to Dr. King in response, really to see if Dr. King's teachings will hold up. And it has been a wild ride since I made those decisions.
So to follow up on that, that's such a good way to start, because I'm thinking about a lot of the teachers that are participating on this call today, including myself. As you see, we're in my classroom, and a lot of us, we take really great care in selecting culturally relevant texts for our students, and texts that are interesting and engaging as well as timely. And in Dear Martin, we see how Dr. King and the nonviolence movement is a sort of anchor for the book as a part of like the Black psyche and the struggle. And I'm wondering, as a writer of literature for Black youth, can you talk about your choice to use themes of the civil rights movement of the 1960s? You spoke a little bit about it. And do you believe it's a safer choice than writing about the current struggle for the Black Lives Matter movement and the overarching themes of Black liberation struggle?
Ooh, I like this question. So Elie Wiesel is the author of a book called Night. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1986. And during his speech, he said this line that will stick with me forever. And this is like, I read his speech later because I was drawing some parallels between him and Dr. King. But in his speech, he said, "It is the memory of evil that will serve as a shield against evil," right? So you have this man who was famous for reminding people of how terrible the Holocaust was. And he told us why he was very big on making those reminders. That's part of the reason that it's important for me, while I am addressing things going on now, to also address what came before, because I do find in my interactions with young people, especially in school spaces, a lot of young people aren't really learning much about the civil rights movement. I remember being 16, this is 2001, and I had US history that year. There was one column in the textbook was dedicated to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And there was a paragraph in the book dedicated to civil rights and the civil rights movement. This is a movement that was the sole reason I existed in this classroom with these other people who didn't look like me, right? Like, I was the only Black kid in this class. I could only be in that class because of things that happened during the civil rights movement. So it bothers me a little bit that we don't talk about how we got here more often in schools, right? So then you have moments like, you have the things that happened to like Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor this year, and George Floyd, and there were a couple, Elijah McClain. Like, you have these terrible things happening to people, and these protests are happening, but a lot of people don't understand that like there's a history of this being effective, right? So when it comes to what I do put in books, my goal, this is true with Dear Martin, this is true with Clean Getaway, and it's true with a book that I'm working on now that will come out next August. It's important to me to inject these books with actual history and actual facts so that nobody can say that what's in them isn't real or doesn't happen. So I definitely will be addressing, like, in future books. I wrote Dear Martin in 2015, right? So like none of this stuff had happened yet. Even Dear Justice, I wrote in 2018, 2019. So like the stuff going on now hadn't happened yet. It's actually kind of sad that it's so relevant, that both of them are still so relevant or have become so relevant again. But I think that I made the right decision in injecting some history and some pieces of the past so we can see how things worked before, and it'll give us some insight into like what we should and shouldn't do with regard to trying to move forward.
Just to expand on that just a little bit more, no, it's no secret to the readers of Dear Martin that some of the events in the book seem to be inspired by actual accounts, right? You talked already about the murder of Jordan Davis. I know there's references to Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice indirectly in the book. is it eerily real to you as a writer to have these stories be continually manifested in our country well after you've told them? And is it surprising to see the ways justice has worked in these circumstances? I mean, even the way you have envisioned justice to work in these situations?
So what's interesting here is like, it's sickening to continue seeing manifestations of stuff that I wrote in a book 5 years ago, right? Like it is, I have a visceral reaction every time I see a new name become a hashtag, because why are these things still happening, right? When it comes to like the administration of justice, honestly, I wish I could say that I'm surprised by some of the things that are continuing to happen. I had to get off of the internet for a few days last week after the Breonna Taylor decision was made public, because, you know, it's easy, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, when we have no idea what's coming, no idea what's even happening right now. It can be very easy to lose hope and to be derailed and feel defeated by some of these decisions that we see kind of come down the pike after these terrible things have happened. But I have come to a place now where I take out my frustration in narrative, right? So Dear Justice came out of my frustrations with all of the non-indictments over the years. Dear Justice also came out of my frustration with stuff that was addressed in Dear Martin but was continuing to happen. And I know that there will be a book that happens a couple of years from now that addresses some of the frustrations that I'm feeling now. What I will say though, I am honored and like thrilled to be in a place where there are a lot of people who care and who are standing against some of these terrible things. Because I know that when Dr. King was alive, and kind of in the interim between his death and like 2012, 2013, 2014, I'll say 2014. So between like 1968 and 2014, you know, you didn't have a lot of people, you didn't have as many people now as you have now who were willing to like stand up and be like, actually, no, this is kind of messed up, you know? Especially white people. Like, let's be honest, you didn't have a ton of white people prior to 2014 who were out here like in the streets, protesting, recognizing the idea of privilege, deciding that they want to say something about racism in this country. So it's a good time to be alive, though it is intensely frustrating at the same time.
Mm. I'm looking at a question from a second grade public school teacher who wants to know if there are topics you feel that can be safely discussed with younger children. I know we're talking about some heavy things here, but can you think of some things that may not, that may be appropriate to discuss with younger children, or are these things appropriate to discuss with younger children that you talk about?
Yeah, they absolutely are. I have younger children. I have a third grader. My son is 8 years old, and I have a 4-year-old, and we talk about this stuff all the time because it's important, right? And there are definitely ways to go about talking to kids about it. I am going to put in the chat a link to a video. I have a friend who is a kindergarten teacher, and she did this video on race and racism that was aimed at her kindergartners. And it is, I mean, it's phenomenal, right? So I'm gonna put this link here because I think that it's a very useful resource to anybody who is interacting. Hold on, that link didn't work. Anybody who has to interact with young people in the classroom. There are ways to go about doing it that won't traumatize the kids and that are appropriate, right? So there are books that I think are very useful. Is that working? You guys try that link and let me know if that link works, because if it doesn't, I'm gonna have to find another one. But she's the tutu teacher, and there's a video called Let's Talk About Race. And so I think that like not talking to kids, we will always speak, it's important to figure it out, right? Because not talking to kids about these things when they're young is, I think, is a mistake, right? Like, I don't want my sons to get to be 10 or 11 and somebody follows them around a grocery store and they have no idea what's going on. Like, that's not a thing that I want to be true for my kids. And I also think it's important even for kids who are not African American and who don't like have to live in any kind of like oppression, if you will, it's important for them too to see and to understand and to take notice of the things that are going on around them. Because at the end of the day, they're going to get older and they're going to be the people who have to like do things differently in order for the world to change. Dr. Ibram Kendi released a picture book called Anti-Racist Baby. And I mean, it was originally a board book, but it's a book that I think is very helpful with regard to like talking about anti-racism in a way that's actually aimed at a toddler, right? So the resources are out there. Everybody should actually, the Tutu teacher, if you follow her on Instagram, she's always giving just incredible book recommendations for young readers, for elementary school readers. And yeah, so we figure it out together. The important thing is to make sure kids know that you see them and that you see them seeing things and needing a deeper understanding of them.
Thank you. So I think you did a really wonderful job writing in the voice of a young Black man in Dear Martin as well as in Dear Justice. I really, really appreciated it. And but I'm curious about how your experience with youth inspired such richness in the stories you tell. And I'm also wondering if we need more stories about the experiences of Black women and their complex relationships with Black men in the law. And do you think that you want to write these stories?
Oh, you just hit me with like 9 questions. I love it. So when it comes to like the voice of the characters in my books, I was the only girl in my friend group growing up. I hung out with a group of like 6 Black male athletes. I heard a lot of things that I really would love to just have never heard, you know, like they treated me the way that they treated each other. But it was in those relationships that I began to understand how they tick a little bit. I have sons only. I live in a house full of male people. And because of that, there is, I don't know, when I sit down to write, a lot of the time, a boy's voice is what will come out. But I absolutely do intend to address, especially criminal justice. I have a criminal justice book that will come out in the fall of 2023. Yes, it is planned for 2023 that will address young women who are dealing with race and racism in the criminal justice system, because it is just as important. Dear Justice came as a result of a request from a pair of my mentees. You're probably going to ask me this later. Sorry, I'm jumping the gun. But I had a pair of mentees, both African-American boys. At the time, they were 16 when they made this request of me, but they both read and loved Dear Martin. It was one of the first books that they'd ever finished. Dear Martin was one of the first books that they'd ever finished. And they text messaged me one day, basically asking me if I would be willing to tell a story that more reflected their lives, right? Because they're not going to Ivy League schools. They are not at the top of their class. They don't go to like ultra rich, ultra white prep schools. They are in their regular public schools, doing their best to just stay out of trouble. So it kind of was an assignment in a sense from a couple of my mentees. And when I had the opportunity to fulfill the wish of a young person that I have the privilege of interacting with, I do try to make it a reality for their sake. Because I said it earlier before we really started broadcasting, but like adults, we can be kind of trash sometimes. And I definitely prefer interacting with young people because there's so much like life and light and brightness. And they have yet to become super jaded. They don't got most of them don't have any bills to pay. So there's so much more space to explore the world and to pick it apart mentally. I don't even know if did I answer your question?
Absolutely, yes, for
Okay.
sure. And I mean, on top of that, I mean, I think I want to ask a question from students to accompany that answer. And there are students from Bell Phillips School who want to know, what nonfiction books do you recommend for youth who like your books?
Ooh, so I will be honest with you, there's not a ton of nonfiction aimed at people in this age range, but Stamped, it is the book that Jason Reynolds adapted from Dr. Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. It's fabulous. There's a book called This Book is Anti-Racist that, to me, it reads like kind of like a 101 manual on like racism and anti-racism and identity and the thing, these key terms, if you will, that we are talking about in the world today. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. There's a young reader's edition of Just Mercy that I highly recommend. The Brian Stevenson book. It's a work of nonfiction. And then Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. There's also a young reader's edition of that I highly recommend. There are a lot of books about, there's a book, it's actually on the National Book Award long list, but it's about the Black women the struggle for Black women to get the right to vote. I can't remember what it's called right now, but I know it will pop up, and I'm sure it will pop up in the comments because y'all are on it, and I'm seeing like all kinds of links showing up here that are awesome. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are the ones that I recommend kind of off the top of my head.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So as we transition into talking a little bit more about the new book, show them the book. Yes, wonderful new book. Would you like to read a little bit for the audience before we ask questions?
Sure.
All right.
I will do that. Okay. As Wynwood Heights Park looms up on his left, Quan lifts the hem of his shirt to wipe his face. It's the fourth time he's done it, so there's a wet spot now. He wonders if there will be any dry spots left by the time he gets the tears to stop. Good thing there's no one around to see. He'd never hear the end of it. He bounces on his toes as his feet touch down on the springy stuff the new playground is built on. There's a sign that says it's ground up old tires, that the play structures are made from recycled water bottles and other discarded plastics, and that the entire area is green. But as Deja pointed out the last time Mama brought them all here, whoever built the thing didn't know their colors because everything is red, yellow, and blue. The thought of his sass-mouthed little sister brings fresh tears to Quan's eyes. He makes a beeline for the rocket ship. It sits off in a corner, separate from everything else, tip pointed at the sky like it could blast off at any moment. Inside the cylindrical base, there are buttons to push and dials to turn and a ladder that leads up to an observation deck with a little window. It's Quan's favorite spot in the world, though he'd never admit that to anyone. When he gets inside, he's so relieved. He collapses against the rounded wall and lets his body slide to the floor like chocolate ice cream down the side of a cone on a hot summer day. His head drops back and he shuts his eyes and lets the tears flow freely. But then there's a sound above him, a cough. The moonlight through the deck window makes the face of the boy staring down at Quan look kind of ghostly. In fact, the longer dude stares without speaking, the more Quan wonders if maybe he is a ghost. Hello? The dude doesn't reply. Now Quan is starting to get creeped out, which makes him mad. This is supposed to be the one place in the world he can relax, where he's not looking over his shoulder or being extra cautious, where he can close his eyes and count down from 10 and imagine shooting into space far, far away from everything and everyone. Yo, why you looking at me like that? Quan spits, each word sharp-tipped and laced with the venom of his rage. The other boy's eyes drop to his hand. He picks at the skin around his thumbs, something Quan does sometimes that gets him yelled at. The boy goes on. I'm sorry, I wasn't expecting anyone else to come in here. Oh. The boys are quiet for a minute, and then, I'm Justice, by the way. Justice. Quan's heard that name before.
Wonderful.
Okay. I have another question. Have you ever experienced brutality or discrimination from like our young Black people you experience daily?
Have I ever experienced brutality or discrimination? Absolutely. I haven't experienced brutality. I haven't experienced police brutality. I have been pulled over without any cause. That was a terrifying experience. I was 19 and I was with a friend. We were driving from Georgia to Chicago. We got pulled over in middle of nowhere, Illinois, like corn on one side of the road and like cows on the other. Like there was nothing there. It's broad daylight. And the police officer comes up to the car. We had not been speeding. I had no idea why we'd been pulled over. Neither of us had any idea why we'd been pulled over. And the officer asked my friend to sit in his squad car while he ran her license and registration. And so I'm sitting in the passenger seat of her car because she was driving, just baffled because, you know, like I said, my father was a police officer and this seemed a little like out of protocol. But then again, we were in another state, so I didn't really think a whole lot of it. Luckily, this is not a story that ends badly. She eventually came back to the car. He gave her her license back, and he told her that she had to take her graduation tassel off of the rearview mirror because you're not allowed to have that up there. That was all he said. And then he let us go. But I'm 35 now, I was 19 then, and I'm still to this day wondering why he pulled us over in the first place, especially in light of like things that I've seen recently, right? Like I feel like that's a thing that could have gone in a completely different direction. And it makes me very cognizant of like how I interact with police officers, despite the fact that I grew up with one. When it comes to discrimination, there's a scene in Dear Martin that I literally pulled from my life. The test score scene where Justice has gotten into Yale early action. Jared did not get in, he got deferred, and Jared is big mad. And so they start talking about qualifications and test scores, and it turns out that Justice got the higher ACT score, but Jared doesn't believe him. I literally plucked that entire scene out of my senior year of high school. I had a female student, I'm the only African-American kid in this class, and I had a female student who sat in front of me, look me in my face, and literally say, "There's no way you got a higher score than me," when she heard what my ACT score was. So a lot of Justice, I know specifically with Justice, a lot of the things that Justice experiences in Dear Martin are things that I've either felt or been through or thought about or been in a position where like I could have gone through. And it is never a pleasant experience dealing with someone, because there's always a person involved. It's never pleasant dealing with someone who is acting in a discriminatory way. But what I will say is that that girl who swore I couldn't have got a higher test score than her is now following me on Instagram. And while that might seem a little silly, that says a lot about what you can accomplish if you decide to just ignore the people who have decided that you're not worthwhile. I get to choose what I believe about myself. And I know, you know, so when you are experiencing discrimination, decide whether or not what the people are saying about you is true. And if it isn't, keep it moving.
Oh, I got to snap to that. That's great. That's amazing. Some more questions from our students. Are you reading more now that you are in quarantine? And were you always a big reader?
I have always been a big reader. One of my favorite stories to tell when I do in-person school visits is that like when I was a kid, I was a reader and I was a liar, which is basically what a storyteller is, right? Like we understand story, we inhale story. I don't think I've ever met a storyteller who doesn't actually like stories. And then you have to be able to lie convincingly in order to tell a good story. So yes, I have been an avid reader for a long time. It took me a while though. I was 27 when I wrote my first book. And it just took me a while to realize that writing books, that telling stories was something that I could do. Because I didn't see a lot of African-American women telling the kind of stories that I like to read. Like I got into Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston and Nella Larson. Like I got into their books when I was at Spelman, but like at no point did I want to emulate any of the characters in the books that I was reading. Like I didn't want to be Celie. I didn't want to be Pecola Breedlove. I didn't want to be these women. I admired their strength. I admired the things that they went through and were able to accomplish and were able to overcome. But like, I didn't want to emulate them in any way. So the idea of a book where the Black character is a heroine in a way that I wanted to be like them was just something that I never saw. So getting to like tell these stories now that I didn't get to see has been just the best experience. And I am reading a good bit. And I read across the board. Right now I'm super into poetry collections because they're like short and you get the core, you get to the core of the message very quickly. A book that I want to recommend is a book called Punching the Air. It's a book in verse. It's by Ibi Zoboi, and she wrote in partnership with Dr. Yusuf Salam, who was one of the exonerated 5 from the Central Park case. So there's a documentary on Netflix called When They See Us. He was one of the boys that documentary focuses on. So they wrote a book about a kid who's incarcerated, like Quan is incarcerated in Dear Justice, but it's written in verse, and it's just beautiful and it moves fast. So yeah, love reading, love it. Almost as much as I love writing.
Yes, 2 different processes too, but very, very going hand together. So I'm going to take a question from the audience and kind of mix it in with another question that I have. I feel like they're similar. So you talked about adults being trash. I love that comment. Sometimes we are. And someone says that they would love to hear your thoughts on the importance of adults doing more to amplify and provide space for youth to lead and to show us the society they want as opposed to the society we've given them. So that's the first part of the question. And in Dear Justice, we finally meet the main character, Laquan, and who's locked up in a juvenile detention facility at a young age. And he talks about his circumstances and the factors that led him to them and the lack of positive influences in his life. So when you think back to being young, 13, 14, 15, maybe a little older, who are the influential people you were connected to, and what specifically were some of the actions from them that set you on your path?
Ooh, these are such good questions. Can you just like come with me and do all of the events?
I would.
So great.
I would.
It's so great. It's so awesome. Okay, so this is I love these questions largely because it gives me an opportunity to talk to the adults in the room. We have to do better, y'all. So much of how we interact with young people is rooted in our own shame about things that we did when we were younger. And like, you got to let that stuff go. Like, just because, and I interact with so many adults now who condemn young people for literally doing the same thing you were doing when you were young. Like, stop doing that. It's not worth anybody's while. Getting out of our own way is one of the best things that we can do, and trusting that young people are seeing things in a different light than we are, that they actually they have it in mind. They have the power and they have the potential to change things. I think that we all do ourselves and the young people around us a disservice when we forget what it was like to be young. So that's my word to the adults. When I was a kid, I had a number of really great influences, thank goodness. You know, like my mom was intensely hard on me, to the point where it was negative. Like it definitely had like a detrimental effect. But my dad wound up being a really good balance. I remember being 14, 15, 16, and me and my dad having these intense conversations about the power of self-awareness and knowing what you're feeling and why, and taking the time to like sit down and write in a journal and work through your thoughts and figure out how you feel about a thing. That is something that I actually found very empowering, having my father tell me that my feelings were valid, that the things I was experiencing they mattered and they were important, and that I should take the time to actually process through them. That was like a huge deal for me as a young person. I also had a few really great teachers. Casey Weeks is the person that Dear Martin is dedicated to. He was my 10th and 11th grade English teacher, and he's a white dude, but he was just like with it. Like he was woke before woke was a thing. And I remember we read Huck Finn when I was in his class, and he would take portions of the book and he would read them aloud the way that they were written, because The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is written by Mark Twain. It's a satire. It's a book that's really anti-slavery, that was published during a time when it was very controversial. But there are parts of it that are written in vernacular, and it's one of those like well-meaning white dude things where like you want to write these characters how they sound, but like 100 years down the line, it just sounds ridiculous, right? So my teacher would read portions aloud, really to point out how ridiculous that they sounded. And it was something that I really appreciated. He's also the person who saw something in me and in my writing and encouraged me to pursue it. And then I had a teacher named Mr. Armand. Mr. Armand was my sole African-American male teacher was he my sole African-American teacher? He was. I had one African-American teacher in 4 years of high school. In even more than that, middle school. I think the last time I had a Black teacher, I was in the first grade.
Mm-hmm.
Dang.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I had a Black teacher in first grade, and I had no Black teachers for the rest of my schooling, except for Mr. Armand. Mr. Armand was my calculus teacher when I was a senior. And again, it was one of those situations where like he saw me in the classroom and decided that I was like worth caring about. And so he would just push me and push me and push me. And I'm glad that he did, because that kind of narrowed focus. Having people who believe in you is a huge deal, y'all. Like if you're young and there's somebody who's like, no, you can do better than this, and they're coming from a place of love, it can just move mountains, you know? So older people, adults, make sure you are pouring life into the young people around you, and you are edifying them, and you are calling out the good things about them, pointing out all of the ways, all of the things that you see in them that could be world changing. It will go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. In one of the flashbacks in Dear Justice, the main character, Quan, describes a meeting between him and his cousin Manny, who also appears in Dear Martin. And he's also Justice's best friend. And I thought it was hilarious. I laughed out loud when he described Manny as his salmon on a river eating cousin. He does this more than once. I thought that was just so hilarious. And, you know, I thought that this perfectly highlighted some of the class distinctions between Black youth. And I'm wondering if you can think of other ways that illuminate these class distinctions between young people of color, the way food does between Manny and Quan.
So say the second part of the question again, because I want to make sure I answer it exactly as you're asking it.
So, you know, I mean, maybe in your youth, you can think of some ways that, you know, separated you from your other students. And in the book, there are ways that class distinctions are very prominent because of private school. And I'm wondering, between youth of color, are there other class distinctions that that are illuminated, or that ways that that illuminate class distinctions between young people of color? I don't know if I'm thinking of a specific example, but maybe that some of the class distinctions informed how you wrote the characters Quan versus the character Manny.
Yeah. Okay. So what's interesting about this question and about exactly what you're talking about is that like class distinction is something that we don't talk about enough, I don't think, especially in Black community. Like, I don't think we talk enough about like how economic inequality affects the distribution of wealth, obviously, and how that distribution of wealth then creates a divide within our own community. And I think about even coming down to things like sneakers, right? As a sneakerhead, I have a lot of sneakers. I have been a sneakerhead since I was 10 years old. I got my first pair of Grant Hill Filas when I was in the 5th grade. And ever since, I think the next year I got my first pair of Air Jordan Concord 11s, right? And so sneaker culture is one of those things that to me does highlight classism and class divides. And the interesting thing about it is that it also highlights this desire to present in a certain way, because there is no way that Quan, even coming from a lower socioeconomic status, would be seen in some busted sneakers, right? So I think about the ways that there are these symbols, I think, that highlight the ways in which we end up being divided along class lines, but they highlight them by being desirable, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making sense, but even just the fact that, like, I know so many people who it's really important to have the latest pair of sneakers, right? Even when there are other things that go unaddressed, the way that we present as Black people is vital. And this has nothing to do with there being something wrong with us or something wrong with our priorities. This has everything to do with racism. It has everything to do with systemic oppression and going back into the past, where if you were Black and you didn't look presentable, it was a bad thing, right? Like, you couldn't walk out into the world as a Black person post Reconstruction, and like, you couldn't look terrible when you went out into the world. You had to be in your church clothes. You had to look your absolute best. Like, these are things that I think it's important for us to start unpacking. And so when you see Justice I mean, when you see Manny and Quan kind of juxtaposed in this book, what's interesting is despite their different experiences, they're sitting in this restaurant, very expensive restaurant. Manny has ordered the salmon that still has the skin on it, and Quan is commenting on it. But I can almost guarantee you they have the same shoes on, right? Mm-hmm. So looking at the ways that we need to just look at it is really my answer here. Like, I think we need to start talking about it more. We need to start talking about money. We need to start talking about the unequal distribution of wealth. We need to start talking about the things that we cling to and why.
Great. That's wonderful. Thank you for that. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A I'm just going to ask. One student asked, how do I reply to a racist statement without getting mad?
I don't reply to them most of the time. I mean, I will say there is no kind of, there's no general answer here. There are so many variables that it's impossible to account for before actually being in a situation. When it is appropriate to respond, because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you just gotta be like, I'm out. Like, I'm good. I'm gonna head on that way. We don't have to communicate. We're good. I see where you're at. When it is overt and deliberate, that's when you walk away. Like, do not engage with people who are overtly racist. It is not worth your time. You are not going to change anybody's mind. You are not going to get anybody who is overtly racist to see things from a different perspective. They have chosen. That is a perspective that they have chosen to believe. When it is rooted in ignorance or rooted in some kind of like unacknowledged privilege, sometimes it's appropriate to start a conversation. When it is appropriate to start a conversation, I typically lead with a question. Sometimes you got to pull that Black mama card and be like, what you say? What was that? Can you repeat that? If they recognize that they have said something foul, they probably are going to be uncomfortable about repeating it. If they are genuinely ignorant and have no idea what they did wrong, they'll repeat it. And then you have an opportunity to ask a question. Well, why do you think that? Why do you feel that? I tend to just not respond at all, to be completely honest. When there is opportunity for dialogue that is going to end in somebody being more enlightened, cool. But that is so rare for me. When it comes to not getting mad, my thing is, why would I get mad? If a person is saying or being racist, like, they're the idiot, what do I need to be mad for? Like, I know what's true about me. So you saying something that makes you look dumb, I'm not getting mad about that. Thank you for showing me your true colors, right? Like, I think that we have so much more power over our reactions. Well, not our reactions, our responses, right? Like, we all have emotions. Some things hit us more viscerally than others, but we get to decide whether or not that emotion is rational and whether or not it's helpful, whether or not we are going to respond according to the emotion or according to rationality or to logic in some way. And for me, I don't be a racist. That's cool. Like, you're not going to stop my paper chasing. So by all means, I just won't talk to you anymore. I have no reason to get mad though. Like,
that's a good answer. And along with that, I think another question that a student had is, what as a student can I do to help stop racism?
Ooh, this is the $1 million question. So I have this like 3-pronged approach. I call it inside, outside, upside down. So inside is first, you got to like look at yourself, right? When I started writing about race and racism, it involved a lot of self digging and like coming to recognize the areas in my own life where I am guilty of moving in a biased way or having biased ideas. Even I had racist ideas. I don't think it's toward my own people. I don't think it's possible to exist in a place like the United States and not have some kind of racist idea somewhere inside of you, because we are all products of our environment. This society is rooted in systemic racism. The way that it was built was on the back of systemic racism and the back of like enslaved people. The way that it continues, there's a lot of systemic racism involved. And until we recognize that, like, yeah, I probably do have some things in myself that I need to uproot and think a little harder about, it's hard to check other people. So the inside thing is recognizing what's in you. Like, you got to recognize your own internalized oppression. You got to recognize the intersections of your identity so that you know, like, I am a queer Black woman, right? that is 3 different marginalizations that come together at 3 different points and in different ways. So I have to recognize, like, what does it mean to be queer? What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be a woman? And how do these 3 different things separately impact me in this country? And then how am I impacted when they come together? Outside is then looking at the world and seeing where the systems are messed up, right? So I think about racism, I think about sexism, I think about homophobia, I think about transphobia, I think about ableism, I think about ageism. I think there are all of these ways that things are set up in this country so that certain people get to sit at the top and everybody else is like in this kind of hierarchy headed down towards the ground, right? So recognizing that is the second thing. And then the third thing is the upside down is when you like decide to start flipping things over. And this is really the answer to the question. It's important, I think, number one, to know how to have like intelligent conversation without getting mad. In order to uproot racism, we have to keep a level head in conversation. Like, you can be mad. Everybody has the right to be mad. But when you're talking to other people, because we are the people at a disadvantage, it's easy for people to just shut out what we're saying, right? I think about the presidential debate last night, which was like, I don't even have adequate words, but I can tell you that if Kamala Harris had done any of the things that either of those 2 men were doing on that stage, the name calling, the cutting, the interrupting, the overstepping the moderator, like, she would have been out of there, right? Like, these are things that we have to recognize. We have to recognize the ways that certain people they have like an advantage and other people are at a disadvantage for no fault of anybody's. It's nobody's fault that this is the case. It's just the way that things are set up. So being able to talk intelligently and being able to have conversations without getting too heated is part of it. Having information is the second part. Knowing what you're talking about is a huge deal. Statistics are so vital, y'all. Like, having information when you want to be a person who is uprooting racism, you got to have facts that you lean on when you're talking. So do your research, know what you're talking about, have things that you can point out, have resources you can point to. It really all goes to being in a position where you know what you're talking about and you can do so calmly. And then you just start conversations. I think that starting conversations and then getting with people who are like-minded and who will help you. There's so much strength in numbers. And collaboration is something that I think we overlook a lot of the time. So that was like, I said a whole bunch. Hopefully it was like synthesizable.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying it too. So a few more questions before we end. But in Dear Justice, I'm thinking about the way whiteness is portrayed. And in between the 2 books, they're portrayed differently. In Dear Martin, justice seems to constantly be at odds with the ways whiteness shows up in his life. And in Dear Justice, whiteness kind of makes a shift in the lives of the main characters. How important is this in terms of how you want the reader to understand issues of racial justice?
Super important, right? So, okay, I get a lot of questions about the way that Dear Martin ends, right? So there's a scene, this is not a spoiler, I promise, but there's a scene at the end of Dear Martin where Dear Martin ends on a reconciliatory note. There's a reconciliation scene that actually makes a lot of people mad, because I find that a lot of us, we would prefer to just be like, right? And it makes sense. When you've been through a trauma, you don't really want to interact with the person who has traumatized you. However, because Dear Martin was a book about Dr. King, it was important to me that it end on some kind of reconciliatory note. Moving into Dear Justice, so really you only see whiteness in the second half of the book. There are a couple of instances in the first half, like there's a new librarian that comes to the library where Quan usually takes refuge and sits, and there's like a nook in the library where he would sit and read books. But there's a new white librarian who just basically like stares him down the whole time he's there. So he doesn't feel comfortable in that space anymore. And then he talks about white boy Sean, who was actually mentioned in Dear Martin. And that is based on a true story, friends, by the way. Any crime or anything you see in Dear Justice that has to do with a kid in a detention center and the reason why they're there, all of those are plucked from real life. I did not make any of that I changed names, obviously, but these are all stories from kids that I have met in detention. So yeah, there's a scene where he talks about a white boy who like stabbed his father in the middle of the night and like wound up getting some kind of like sleepwalking thing. He got like a sleepwalker. Somebody said he was sleepwalking, so he got off and like wound up having like a week in a different type of facility that is not secure at all. Like it's basically like a high school with barbed wire around it. So those are the two instances in the beginning of the book. But in the second half of the book, you see where we can't actually defeat or uproot racism without white people. Like when you have the people who are in the position of power making the decisions and shaping the policy, etc., those are the people who also have to be a part of shaping policy that puts other people at an advantage, right? Mm-hmm. So it was important to me in Dear Justice to show that like we do actually have to do this stuff together. Like it's not possible to completely eliminate the majority, because at this point, white people are still the majority in this country. You can't just be like, oh, we're not going to interact with the majority, unfortunately. So it was important to me to show that there are not only are there ways of interacting in a way that's beneficial to people of color, but also like it's vital. Like there are things that happen to Quan that wouldn't happen without the assistance of certain people in certain positions, right? So whiteness can be detrimental, but it can also be beneficial if it is wielded in the right way.
Wonderful. So just a couple more questions that are from the audience in the Q&A. Someone wants to know if faith plays a role in your writing.
Not directly. Like there are probably more so actually, no, not really. Like most of my books don't have a direct faith element in them. Like faith's a part of my life. It just doesn't really show up on the page in my work. It will if it needs to, if that makes sense. But in a very general sense, the books that I write, they focus on like whatever topic is at the center. Like economic inequality is jackpot. Dear Justice is the juvenile justice system. Clean Getaway is racism, but for middle graders. Like there's typically a central thing. Sometimes there's a mention of church, sometimes not, but in general, not really.
Another question is, are there books, movies, or podcasts that you have found or been told that we need to stop reading because of misrepresentation?
I mean, you know, there's a list of things that people are like, don't read this, don't watch this, don't listen to this. However, I don't know. I'm not one who ascribes to the idea that because there's misrepresentation, I shouldn't. For me, as a creator, there are things that I engage with that are just rife with misrepresentation because I use them as like learning tools, right? So I look at them or I read them, and I will say though, I'm not about to pay for it. Like I'm not gonna, for instance, there's a book, no, let me not do that. But there's an adult novel that came out earlier this year that basically set the internet on fire. It was one of Oprah's book club picks, and it's about this like Mexican woman basically dealing with some crisis at the border, and it's written by a white lady. And like, understandably, Latinx people were furious that this woman was paid so much money to tell this story that really just wasn't very good and was very, very misrepresentative. I think that's a book that I would check out from the library so that I could read and see everything she did wrong and then learn to be like, I don't want to do that. Like there are things that I just don't want to engage with, but I do think that sometimes it's important to see the importance of telling your own stories, right? So when I think about things where the representation is terrible, I have a couple of books that just pop into my head that I won't name, but there's one book, for instance, that I read years ago about a girl, a Black bisexual girl, written by this white girl. And I read that and I was like, really? But it fueled my writing of Odd One Out, right? Because like, I'm reading this trash story that you wrote about somebody like me, And I obviously can do that better. So I'm going to use this as fuel to do it better. But yeah, if you want to know what to avoid, like just Google it. Like I think you can Google podcasts that are misrepresentative and you could get a whole list.
Some students want to know if you still live in your hometown. I think it's Atlanta. And how is it when you're recognized there?
I am rarely recognized. I do still live in Atlanta. I love my city. I was born and raised here. I did spend some time. I have lived in other places. Like I lived abroad for a while. But like I said, I rarely get recognized. The few times that I have been recognized, it's because of like I'm on my hairstylist has more Instagram followers than I do. And people will see me on her page and they'll see me and they'll be like, oh, you're one of Rachel Rand's clients. And I'm like, yeah, I am. That's my sole purpose in life. But yeah, I don't typically get recognized. A few times I have been recognized, it's either been like in bookstores or I was in a Starbucks once and then I got home later and there was a tweet about Nic Stone is sitting in my Starbucks. Oh my gosh. And I was like, oh, that's actually don't do that. That's weird. Like to think that like I'm sitting there the whole time and you saw me and you didn't say anything. I could have been doing something foul and like it would have been all over the internet.
Well, to talk a little bit about maybe pop culture, Twitter, and all of the discussions that happen there, I would love for you to chime in on the discussion about Black Panther, since you wrote a book about that, about Shuri in particular, I know. And there's talk of the replacement of Chadwick Boseman as we look forward to the next installment of Black Panther. And some folks think that Shuri should be the new Black Panther. Do you think there should be a new actor to portray King T'Challa, or do you think Shuri should be the new Black Panther?
I mean, obviously, I think Shuri should be the new Black Panther.
Obviously.
I get to write her. First of all, like I get to write her story, and also in comic canon, that's a plot line in the comic canon. Like there's in the comics, T'Challa is like killed in battle, and he's like hanging out on the ancestral plane and not being permitted to return to his body. So Shuri has to take over, and it's fabulous. I love it. I think it's great. So I am interested to see what they decide is what I'm going to say here. Because I do think it would be cool to see her as the Black Panther. But I also know that there are a lot of ways. As a storyteller, I can tell you there are so many ways that this could go. Like, we don't actually know for sure that Killmonger is actually dead. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he suddenly came back and was like, there's so many things that you can do with a story like this. So I'm just excited to see what's coming next in the film series. The next Shuri book is out in February though, and that's exciting.
Wonderful. Oh, wonderful. So I don't see any more questions. So that is an opportunity for me to thank you for your energy and engaging dialogue today, and for being with us and giving us so much knowledge and wisdom that you have. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate you writing the amazing books that you wrote.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, lovelies.
I'll hand it over to you, Daniel.
I can't do anything but thank you, Shana. What an amazing presentation, which of course I knew it would be, but and thank you to Nic Stone and for your continuing writing. Looking forward to the next Black Panther. And looking forward, since it's only the second day of Dear Justice, looking forward to getting in the hands. I know it's already in one of our booksellers' top 5 books of the year, so we'll be the newsletter. Thank you to the Access Program for helping put this together, and we look forward to continuing work with Kelly and the various schools in all sorts of ways. So thank you, everybody, and thanks to all of you for coming, because we wouldn't have a bookstore or a community or a school system without you. So
thank you, Access. We love you.
All right, everybody, have a great day.
have a great day.
You as well. Thank you.
Bye.